Grace Whitfield had been arranging seating cards for exactly 6 years, and in 6 years, she had never once placed her own name anywhere the light could find it. Tonight was no different. She stood at the small table near the kitchen doors of the Cross Enterprises annual dinner, checking place settings against a printed list, and set her own card at a narrow side table meant for junior staff, a habit so automatic by now that she didn't consciously register doing it at all. It was simply where she belonged, close enough to the room to be useful, far enough from it to be forgotten. She had learned a long time ago that being forgotten was safer than being seen. The memory came uninvited, the way it always did on nights like this: an 8th grade class photo, 3 rows of children arranged by height, and Grace standing at the very edge of the frame because the photographer had asked her to make room without ever asking anyone else to move. She had spent every school photo since finding the edge of the frame before anyone had to ask. Grace! One of the junior assistants, Priya, appeared at her elbow, breathless with the particular energy of someone who loved being first with information. Did you see the guest list? Half the rival families sent representatives tonight, and apparently 3 different women from the Ashford network are here specifically hoping to sit near Mr. Cross. I saw, Grace said, adjusting a fork that didn't need adjusting. You're not even a little bit nervous? Priya said. I would be terrified serving a room like this. I'm not serving, Grace said. I'm just making sure nothing goes wrong. That, too, was true in a way Priya wouldn't fully understand. Grace had already caught 2 errors that evening that nobody else had noticed. A supplier delivery scheduled an hour later than the kitchen expected, quietly corrected before it became a problem. A seating conflict between 2 associates whose organizations were technically not currently at war, but close enough that proximity mattered. Nobody thanked her for either. Nobody needed to know. That was, in its own way, exactly how she preferred it. Damien Cross arrived precisely on time, the way he always did, and the room's energy shifted the moment he walked through the door, conversations quieting by degrees, postures straightening. The particular electricity that surrounded a man everyone in that room had reason to fear and reason to want standing close to. Grace watched from her position near the kitchen doors, invisible in the way she'd spent years perfecting and catalogued out of habit. Exactly who was maneuvering to be seen by him. 3 women from the Ashford network, dressed for exactly this purpose. 2 lieutenants angling for a word before dinner began. A rival associate's daughter, introduced with obvious intent by her father. Damien moved through all of it with the same controlled, unreadable calm he brought to everything, greeting each approach with precisely as much warmth as courtesy required and not 1 degree more. Dinner began. The first course was served. Grace ate quietly at her small table, half listening to Priya's ongoing commentary about who was sitting where, and did not notice, until the room had already gone silent around her, that every head at the main table had turned in her direction. Damien's voice carried clearly across the room, calm and absolute in the particular way that made arguing with it feel physically impossible. You're sitting beside me tonight. For 1 full second, Grace genuinely believed she had misheard him. She looked up, expecting to find some other Grace the comment might have been meant for, some mistake about to correct itself. Every face at the main table was turned toward her instead, the Ashford women's polite smiles frozen into something considerably less polite. Priya's mouth actually falling open beside her. Sir, Grace said carefully, her voice barely carrying over the silence. I think there might be some confusion about the seating arrangement. I can check the... There's no confusion. Damien rose from his own chair, unhurried, and crossed the length of the room himself, past 3 of the city's wealthiest, most eligible women, past 2 lieutenants who'd spent the entire cocktail hour angling for exactly the kind of attention he was now walking straight past. He stopped at Grace's small table and pulled out the chair beside his own seat, visible from every angle in the room, with the same unbothered ease he might have used to open a car door. Grace, he said again, quieter now, though the whole room could still hear it. You're sitting beside me tonight. The walk from the small table to the main one felt, to Grace, considerably longer than the actual distance required. She was aware of every eye in the room, aware of the whispers already beginning at the edges of her hearing, aware of the particular, unbearable sensation of being looked at that she had spent 6 years successfully avoiding. She sat. Damien returned to his own seat beside her without further comment, and dinner continued, conversation slowly, awkwardly resuming around the enormous, unspoken question now sitting at that table alongside her. Grace did not eat much of the second course. She was too busy running through every possible explanation, none of which made sense. A mistake he refused to correct out of pride. A test of some kind. A joke at her expense that hadn't fully landed yet. It was only near the end of the evening, walking her to her car through the cold parking structure while his driver waited a respectful distance away, that Damien finally said anything at all about it. "You're wondering why," he said, not a question. "I'm trying not to," Grace admitted. It seemed easier not to ask. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved across Damien's face, gone before it fully formed. "I've been watching you work longer than you realize," he said. Grace waited for more. It didn't come. He simply held the car door for her, the same unbothered courtesy he'd shown pulling out her chair, and walked back toward his own car without another word, leaving Grace standing in the cold, replaying a sentence that answered absolutely nothing at all and somehow felt, despite that, like the truest thing anyone had said to her in years. By 9 the next morning, half the office already knew. Grace felt at the moment she stepped off the elevator the particular quiet that falls over a room when people have just stopped talking about you, followed by the murmur that starts up again once they think you're out of earshot. 2 junior assistants near the copier weren't even trying very hard to be quiet. I heard he pulled out her chair himself, in front of the Ashford women. Why her, though? I mean, no offense, but she's the secretary. She files things. Grace kept walking, her face carefully neutral, the old, practiced skill of pretending not to hear things that were, in fact, landing exactly as intended. She reached her desk to find her coffee already there, made precisely the way she took it, a splash of oat milk, 1 sugar, still steaming, though she hadn't asked anyone to bring it, and hadn't mentioned her order to a single person in weeks. Damien's office door was open. He glanced up as she passed, said nothing about the coffee, and returned to the report in front of him as though nothing at all had happened. Grace stared at the cup for a long moment before she let herself sit down. It happened again 2 days later, a light lunch appearing at her desk at exactly 1 o'clock. The day she'd skipped breakfast and worked through her usual lunch hour finishing a supplier audit no one had asked her to double-check. She hadn't told anyone she'd missed a meal. She was fairly certain, standing there holding a sandwich she hadn't ordered, that Damien Cross had somehow simply noticed. "You don't have to keep doing that," she said, finally, standing in his doorway that afternoon with more courage than she usually allowed herself. "Doing what?" Damien said, not looking up from his desk. "The coffee. The food. Whatever this is." Grace's voice wavered, then steadied. "People are already talking about the dinner. I don't need anything else giving them more to say." Damien looked up at that, something unreadable in his expression. "I'm not doing it for what people say, Grace. I'm doing it because you skip meals when you're focused on work, and nobody else in this building seems to have noticed that in 3 years." Grace had no answer for that. She retreated back to her desk, unsettled by an explanation that made a strange, uncomfortable kind of sense. The particular discomfort of being seen clearly by someone she'd assumed had never looked closely at all. It was a week later, in a meeting she wasn't technically required to attend, that the reason finally began to take a different shape entirely. Damien had called together his senior lieutenants, Marcus, 2 regional managers, and Preston Kane, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s who had been with the organization nearly as long as Damien himself, to address a discrepancy in a recent shipping manifest. Grace sat at the back of the room, notebook open, there in her usual capacity as the person who quietly documented everything and was rarely asked to speak. "The numbers on the Baton Rouge shipment don't reconcile," Marcus was saying, frustration edging into his voice. "We've had 3 people look at it. Nobody can find where the discrepancy originates." Grace, without fully meaning to, spoke. "It's not the shipment," she said. "It's the invoice dates. Someone adjusted the delivery timestamp on the manifest by 6 hours, which shifts the whole reconciliation. If you check against the original driver logs instead of the updated system entry, the numbers actually match. The room went quiet. Preston Kane turned to look at her properly for what might have been the first time in 3 years. "How would you even know that?" he said, not unkindly, but with the particular condescension of a man surprised a secretary had spoken at all. "Because I filed the original driver logs myself," Grace said simply. 6 weeks ago. Damien said nothing in the moment, but Grace saw him watching her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, not surprise exactly, but the quiet satisfaction of a man whose private suspicion had just been confirmed in front of an audience. Later that evening, once the office had mostly emptied, Damien found her still at her desk, cross-referencing a set of numbers that had nothing to do with the meeting at all. "You caught something today that 3 trained men missed," he said. "I just remembered the paperwork," Grace said, not looking up. "It's not really a skill. It's just my job." "It's exactly a skill," Damien said. "One I'm going to need, actually, for something considerably more sensitive than a shipping discrepancy." That got her attention. She looked up at him fully for the first time that evening. "There's a leak," Damien said, lowering his voice though the office was empty. "Information has been reaching a rival faction that shouldn't have any way of knowing it. I've had Marcus and 2 senior analysts looking into it for 3 weeks. They've found nothing." He paused. "I want you to look at it instead." Grace stared at him, certain she'd misunderstood. "Me. Not Marcus. Not your security team. Me." "You?" Damien said. "Because in 6 weeks, you've caught 3 discrepancies nobody else noticed, and you did it without ever once trying to take credit for any of them. I trust people who notice details more than I trust people who are simply loyal. You happen to be both." Grace sat with that for a long moment, an old, familiar instinct telling her this was exactly the kind of attention that eventually led somewhere painful, a test she'd fail, a trust she'd somehow betray without meaning to, a moment where he'd realized she wasn't actually as capable as tonight's small victory suggested. "If I do this," she said carefully, "and I'm wrong, or I miss something, then you'll have tried, and I'll have learned something about the leak either way," Damien said. "I'm not asking you to be infallible, Grace. I'm asking you to look at something with the same attention you've been giving invoices nobody else bothered to double-check." She took the folder he offered, thin, careful, containing only the barest outline of what had gone missing and when, and spent the next 4 nights at her kitchen table, spreading printouts across every available surface, cross-referencing shipment schedules against communication logs against personnel rosters with the same quiet, methodical focus she brought to everything she did without ever once expecting anyone to notice. On the 4th night, close to midnight, she found it, a pattern buried 3 layers deep in scheduling data. A timing correlation that only made sense if someone with detailed operational access had been feeding advance information to a rival faction for months. She stared at the pattern for a long time, the cold, sinking certainty settling over her before she'd even fully traced it to its source. The access required to manipulate this particular set of records didn't belong to a driver, or a warehouse manager, or anyone at the edges of Damien's organization. It belonged to someone standing considerably closer to the center of it than either of them had wanted to believe. Grace brought the findings to Damien the next morning, laying the printouts across his desk with hands that were, for once, steady. "It's not a driver," she said. "It's not a warehouse contact. Whoever fed this information had access to route scheduling and client communications at the same time, which narrows it considerably. There are maybe 6 people in this organization with that kind of overlap." Damien studied the pages in silence for a long moment. "6 people I trust," he said quietly. "I know," Grace said. "I checked twice hoping I was wrong." He called the 6 names together the following afternoon under the pretense of a routine security review: Marcus, 2 regional managers, Preston Kane, and 2 others whose access matched the pattern Grace had traced. Grace sat at the back of the room again, notebook open, prepared to say nothing unless directly asked. Preston noticed her presence immediately. "Since when does the secretary sit in on operations discussions?" he said, loud enough for the room to hear, an edge of contempt in his voice that hadn't been there the week before. "No offense, Grace, but this isn't exactly filing. She's here because she found the pattern behind the leak. Damien said, his voice carrying none of the warmth he'd shown Grace all week, only the flat authority that ended most arguments before they started. If you have a problem with that, Preston, I'd suggest bringing me the analysis your own team failed to produce in 3 weeks. Preston's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further. Damien nodded to Grace. Walk them through it. Grace stood, and for a moment, old instinct nearly won, the urge to defer, to soften her findings into a suggestion rather than a conclusion, to make herself smaller in a room full of men who clearly expected her to be. She thought briefly of every meeting she'd sat through in 6 years without speaking, every correction she'd made quietly rather than aloud. She did not soften anything. The delivery timestamps on 3 separate shipments were altered by exactly the same margin, she said, laying out the pattern methodically, page by page, answering every skeptical question Preston raised with a precision that left him with progressively less room to argue. By the time she finished, the room's skepticism had visibly cracked, replaced by the particular silence of people recalculating how much they'd underestimated someone. That's, one of the regional managers said slowly, actually airtight. Preston said nothing at all, and Grace noticed, with a small, private satisfaction, that he wouldn't quite meet her eyes for the rest of the meeting. Afterward, alone in his office, Damien told her plainly what he hadn't said in front of the others. That analysis was sharper than anything my actual security team produced in 3 weeks, he said. I don't say that lightly, Grace. I just followed the paperwork, Grace said, the old deflection rising automatically. Stop doing that, Damien said, not unkindly. Stop making yourself smaller every time someone tells you you're good at something. Grace looked at him, caught off guard by how precisely he'd named something she hadn't realized was quite so visible. Can I ask you something? Damien said after a moment, his tone shifting into something quieter, more careful. Why do you never appear in the company photos? I noticed it going through the archive last month. Every team event, every year. You're never in a single one. Grace's chest tightened, an old, familiar defensiveness rising fast. I'm usually the one taking them, she said, which was true, though not the whole truth. Damien studied her for a moment, clearly aware there was more beneath the answer, and, to her quiet relief, did not push further. The investigation deepened over the following days, Grace and Damien working late into several evenings, cross-referencing the 6 names against every remaining data point until the pattern narrowed further, not eliminating Preston entirely, but revealing that his access alone couldn't account for everything the leak had exposed. Someone else, someone whose fingerprints were harder to trace, had to be involved as well. It was during one of those late evenings, the office empty except for the 2 of them, that Marcus knocked once and stepped inside, his expression tight. Boss, you need to see this. He set a phone on the desk, screen lit with a message. This came through on an anonymous line an hour ago. Whoever sent it knew to use a channel only a handful of people inside this organization have access to. Damien read the message, his jaw tightening. Grace leaned forward despite herself and felt her stomach drop reading the words over his shoulder. Tell your secretary to stop asking questions that aren't hers to ask. They know, Grace said quietly. Whoever this is, they know I'm the one who's been tracing it. Damien set the phone down slowly, his expression shifting into something Grace hadn't seen from him before. Not simply focused anger, but a controlled, deliberate stillness that made even Marcus take half a step back. Before either of them could say anything further, Grace's own phone buzzed on the desk beside her. A message from a number she didn't recognize. She read it once. Then again, her hands going cold. I know where you live, Grace. Stop while you still can. Damien took the phone from her hands before she'd fully processed the words, reading the message twice, his expression settling into something controlled and dangerous in a way Grace had never seen directed at anyone in the room. Marcus, he said quietly, I want someone on Grace's building tonight. Quietly. And I want that number traced before morning. Already on it, Marcus said, already moving. Grace sat very still, the message still glowing faintly on the screen in front of her. This is because of the investigation, she said. Because I found the pattern. Yes, Damien said, not softening it. Which means whoever sent this understands exactly how close you've gotten, and they're frightened enough to threaten you directly instead of simply covering their tracks more carefully. She went home that night with 2 of Damien's men positioned discreetly on her street, though she didn't sleep more than a few restless hours, replaying the message over and over, an old, familiar fear resurfacing beneath the new one. Not just danger, but the particular terror of having finally been seen, only to have that visibility turn immediately into a target. She arrived at work late the next morning, something she hadn't done in 3 years. Her cardigan pulled tightly around her arms despite the office's mild temperature. Damien noticed instantly. Grace. He crossed to her desk before she'd even set down her bag. What happened? Nothing, she said too quickly. I just overslept. Grace. His voice dropped, quiet and absolutely serious. Show me your arm. She hesitated a half-second too long, and he saw it. The way she'd been holding her left forearm slightly away from her body. The careful angle of her sleeve. When she finally pushed the cardigan back, the bruise was already darkening, a torn seam at the cuff where someone had grabbed hard enough to tear the fabric. Damien went very still. Someone followed me last night, Grace said quietly, the composure she'd been holding all morning finally cracking. Before your men were in position, near the parking garage. He didn't say much. Just that I should stop asking questions that weren't mine to ask, and that next time he wouldn't just grab my arm. Who? Damien said. The word came out low, controlled, carrying a weight Grace felt in her chest before she'd even processed the question. I didn't see his face clearly, she said. It was dark, and he was gone before. He said her name again, quieter this time, though no less absolute. If you know anything, a voice, a build, anything at all? She hesitated, something flickering behind her eyes that told him she was holding something back, not out of dishonesty, but out of a fear she hadn't fully named even to herself. If I tell you, she said slowly, you'll kill him. Damien didn't deny it. The silence that followed confirmed everything she needed to know. I don't need you to avenge me, Grace said, her voice steadying even as her hands trembled at her sides. I need you to trust that I can help solve this without turning into someone who needs saving every time it gets dangerous. I've spent my whole life being underestimated because of how I look, Damien. I'm not going to let being afraid turn me into someone who's also underestimated because I'm fragile. I know you're not weak, Damien said, something raw entering his voice for the first time since she'd known him. That's exactly why I can't just let this go, Grace. If you were someone I didn't care about, I'd let security handle it quietly and move on with the investigation. I can't do that. Not with you. The admission landed between them with a weight neither of them fully addressed, both too aware of the danger still pressing at the edges of the room to let the moment become anything more than what it needed to be right now. Marcus returned an hour later, his expression grim in a way that told Damien, before he said a word, that the news wasn't going to be simple. The number traced to a burner, Marcus said. Untraceable on its own. But I cross-referenced the timing against building access logs from last night, the same night someone tried to intimidate Grace near her apartment. He hesitated. Boss, whoever's behind this isn't just connected to Preston's access level. The timing lines up with someone who was inside this building past midnight, using credentials that shouldn't have been active that late. Whose credentials? Damien said. Marcus set a printed log on the desk, and Damien's expression changed the moment he read the name at the top of it, not Preston Kane. Not any of the names they'd already suspected, but someone Damien had trusted for considerably longer than either of the others. Someone whose loyalty had never once in 15 years been seriously questioned. Grace watched his face carefully. Who is it? She asked quietly. Damien did not answer immediately. He set the log down slowly, the full weight of the name settling into the room like something physical. It's someone I've trusted since before I ran this organization, he said finally. Which means this isn't just a leak anymore, Grace. It's a betrayal I never once saw coming, sitting closer to me than anyone I would have suspected in 1,000 guesses. Marcus turned the laptop screen toward them both. Victor Alvarez, Finance Director. 11 years with the organization. His access matches the leak pattern, Grace said, scanning the timeline. But something's off. Look at the transfer authorization on the third shipment. logged at 11:47 p.m. But Victor's video call with two regional partners didn't end until 11:50. Could be a system lag, Marcus said. It's not lag, Grace said slowly. It's a 3-minute window where he's authorizing a payment and sitting in a meeting at the same time. Someone built a delay into the timestamp so a careless glance would miss it. She kept digging, the office quiet around her except for the soft click of keys. Damien standing close enough that she was aware of him without looking up. An hour later, she found the second thread, a routing pattern Victor had used to disguise the shell account as a routine supplier. One small transposed digit away from a real vendor Cross Enterprises had worked with for years. He didn't just leak information, Grace said finally, sitting back. He built an entire disguise around it. Falsified the timestamp so it would look like the authorization happened earlier than the call ended. Rerouted the account so it would pass a casual audit. This isn't panic, Damien. This took months of planning. Damien read the evidence in silence, his jaw tightening with each new layer Grace uncovered. 11 years, he said quietly, and I never once suspected him. Nobody did, Grace said. That's exactly why it worked. Victor was confronted that evening in a private meeting that included only Damien, Marcus, and, at Damien's explicit insistence, Grace herself. His composure held for exactly as long as it took Damien to lay the evidence across the table. 11 years, Victor said finally, bitterness surfacing in his voice like something long buried. You gave Marcus the partnership. I built half the financial infrastructure this organization runs on. And you handed my future to a man who talks louder in meetings than I do. So you sold us out, Damien said, flat and absolute. I found someone who valued what I actually knew, Victor said. Then his eyes moved to Grace, something ugly surfacing in his expression. And you, the secretary. He said the word with deliberate contempt. Sitting in this room like you belong here. We both know the only reason you're anywhere near this conversation is because Damien decided he wanted something from you that has nothing to do with competence. The words landed exactly where Victor intended them to. For one brief, unguarded moment, Grace felt the old instinct rise, the same one that had kept her at the edge of every photograph. At the smallest table in every room, apologizing for a body and a presence she'd been taught for years to make as small as possible. She felt the pull to lower her eyes, to let the silence swallow the accusation the way it always had before. She looked at Damien, saw him already drawing breath to answer for her. She spoke first. I found the 3-minute gap between your login and the call that proves you weren't where you claimed to be, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. I found the falsified timestamp you used to hide it. I found the shell account disguised 1 digit away from a real vendor, built specifically so a normal audit would walk right past it. She held Victor's gaze without flinching. None of that required Damien to want anything from me, Victor. It required me to read your paperwork more carefully than 11 years of seniority ever taught you to hide it. Victor's mouth opened, some further contempt already forming. You've spent this whole meeting trying to make this about why I'm allowed in this room, Grace said, cutting him off before he could finish. I'd rather talk about why you thought nobody would ever look closely enough to notice what you'd built. The room went silent. Damien said nothing, watching her with an expression that carried something deeper than approval, the quiet, unmistakable look of a man witnessing exactly what he'd already believed about her, finally proven in front of someone who'd tried to take it from her. Victor had no answer left. 11 years of careful concealment collapsed under evidence he couldn't argue with, and Marcus moved without needing to be told. Get him out, Damien said quietly. Victor was handed over to the organization's own internal consequences that same night, the details of which Grace didn't ask about and Damien didn't volunteer. 3 days later, once the immediate danger had fully cleared, Damien came to her apartment himself rather than sending Marcus with an update, a small detail Grace noticed, and didn't mention, though it settled warm and unexamined somewhere in her chest. It's over, he said. Victor's dealt with. The leak is closed. I know, Grace said. Marcus called this morning. I didn't come to repeat what Marcus already told you, Damien said. Grace waited, an old caution still holding her steady. I want to give you a real choice, Damien said. Not an obligation. Not a debt for staying safe this week. You can walk away from all of this completely if that's what you want. Full protection, resources, a clean start somewhere else. Nobody would think less of you for choosing that. You're offering me an exit, Grace said slowly. I'm asking what you actually want, Damien said. Not what you think you're supposed to say. Not what makes the least amount of trouble for anyone else. What you want, Grace. Nobody had ever asked her that plainly before. Not her family, who'd spent years commenting on her plate before they asked about her day. Not the people who decided, long before she had any say in it, exactly how much space she was allowed to take up in a room. Grace stood in her own doorway for a long moment, feeling the old insecurity rise quietly beneath the surface, and, for the first time, simply let it exist without letting it decide anything for her. I don't want to leave, she said finally. Not because I need protecting. Because for the first time since I can remember, someone looked past everything I've spent years hiding behind and asked what I actually wanted instead of telling me where I belonged. Something in Damien's carefully guarded expression eased completely. Neither of them moved to close the remaining distance between them, though the air between them had changed, charged now, quiet, full of everything neither one was quite ready to name. Then stay, he said. I will, Grace said. She closed the door behind him a few minutes later and stood alone in the quiet of her apartment for a long moment, aware, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she had just chosen something for herself, not the smallest table, not the edge of the frame, but a place she'd decided, on her own terms, that she was finally willing to occupy. The invitation arrived 3 weeks after Victor's downfall, and Grace noticed, reading it at her desk, that her first instinct was already different. The old habit surfaced anyway, quiet and automatic, a flicker of calculation about which table would draw the least attention, which corner of the room would let her disappear the way she always had. She caught herself doing it and, for the first time, simply stopped. She asked Priya to handle the seating cards instead. Where do you want to sit? Priya asked, confused. I'll figure it out when I get there, Grace said, and meant it. That evening, standing in front of her closet, the old anxiety tried to resurface too. The familiar inventory of what would hide the most, what would draw the least attention, what would let her move through a room unremarked. She pushed past 3 outfits chosen exactly that way before her hand stopped on the deep green dress she'd owned for 2 years and never once worn outside her apartment. She'd bought it on impulse, admired it in the mirror alone, and then quietly decided it wasn't for her. Not because of anything wrong with the dress, but because some old, well-worn voice in her had insisted, without evidence, that certain colors, certain cuts, certain kinds of attention belonged to other women. She put it on anyway. She caught her reflection in the hallway mirror on her way out, and, instead of scanning immediately for what needed fixing, she let herself simply look, not longer than a few seconds. But she didn't look away first. The dinner was the same room, the same chandeliers, the same crowd of powerful people who'd once watched her walk its length in stunned silence. This time, Grace didn't hesitate at the entrance the way she had months ago, waiting for someone to notice her mistake and correct it. She walked straight to the main table, to the chair beside Damien's, and sat down before he'd had the chance to rise, before anyone could offer her the seat as though it needed offering at all. Damien looked at her, something unmistakable moving across his face, not surprise, but the quiet, satisfied stillness of a man watching someone finally claim something he'd only ever been able to hand to her once. You didn't wait for me to pull out the chair, he said. I didn't need you to, Grace said. I decided I wanted to sit here. Last time you told me there might be some confusion about the seating arrangement, Damien said, something warm moving beneath the words. There's no confusion this time, Grace said. I know exactly where I belong. Conversation moved around them through dinner, and Grace noticed how differently the room treated her now. Not because anything about her appearance had changed, but because she no longer flinched under attention, no longer apologized silently for the space she occupied, no longer waited for someone else's permission before speaking. A woman 2 seats down leaned over during the second course. That color is stunning on you, she said. I could never pull off that shade. The old Grace would have deflected instantly. Oh, I almost didn't wear it. It's probably too much, some small. Automatic apology offered before anyone else could judge her first. "Thank you," Grace said instead, and let the compliment simply exist, unchallenged, exactly as it was given. Something in her chest settled at how easy it turned out to be, once she stopped fighting it. Later, once most of the guests had gone, Damien found her near the terrace doors, looking out over the dark grounds. "You're different tonight," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Not really," Grace said. "I still notice when people look at me. I still remember every table I ever sat at alone, every photograph I stood at the edge of so nobody would have to make room for me." She turned to face him. "I just don't let it decide anything for me anymore." Damien was quiet a moment, something unguarded moving behind his usually careful composure. "Do you know what actually changed tonight?" he asked. "Tell me." "You stopped waiting for someone to tell you that you belonged here," he said. "The chair. The dress. The compliment you just accepted instead of arguing with. None of it needed my permission, Grace. You just finally believed that yourself." Grace looked at him for a long moment. "I spent a long time thinking the only thing people would ever really see was what was wrong with me," she said quietly. "My body. My weight. All the reasons I assumed I didn't belong in rooms like this one. I never saw any of that as something that needed fixing," Damien said. "I noticed you long before that dinner, Grace. Not despite anything about you. Because of everything about you. The way you caught things nobody else caught. The way you never once tried to make yourself important by pretending to be someone else." He held her gaze steadily. "I never wanted you to become someone different. I wanted you to stop believing you needed to." The words settled over her like something she'd been waiting years to hear from someone who actually meant it. "For what it's worth," Grace said, a small smile finally breaking through, "you're the one who dragged me into that chair the first time. Don't act like you get to take credit for me choosing it myself." "I have no intention of taking credit," Damien said. "I only intend to make sure you never feel the need to disappear again. Not in this organization. Not in any room I'm standing in." Neither of them moved to close the small distance still left between them. It sat there instead, charged and unresolved. The particular kind of silence that exists between two people who both understand exactly what's being held back and have quietly agreed to let it wait a little longer. "I should go," Grace said, though she made no move to leave. "You could stay," Damien said, "if you wanted to." Grace considered it, considered him, considered the entire unlikely distance between the woman who'd once said her own name at the smallest table in the building and the woman standing here now, in a dress she'd almost never worn, in a chair nobody had to give her. "Another night," she said softly. "I'd like to see where this goes first." Something that might have been relief moved across Damien's face. "Then I suppose I'll have to be patient." "You've been patient this whole time," Grace said. "I don't think one more night is what breaks you." She left the terrace a few minutes later, and Damien watched her go, understanding, with a clarity that surprised him even after everything, that whatever this had become between them, it was no longer something either of them could call simply professional. Grace walked out into the cool night air, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not glance back over her shoulder to see if anyone was watching her leave. She had spent 6 years learning exactly how to disappear, how to stand at the edge of every photograph, how to choose the smallest table, how to make herself so quiet and so careful that no one would ever have reason to look twice. It had taken one dinner, one chair, and one man who refused to look past her to teach her the only thing that had ever actually needed to change. Not her body, not her face, not the space she took up in her room, only the belief that she had to make herself smaller to deserve any of it at all. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe for more emotional Mafia romance stories. And tell us in the comments, have you ever had a moment where you finally stopped shrinking yourself for someone else's comfort? Let us know where you're watching from, and we'll see you in the next chapter.